Hi, it is Keela and Kyle here with Decise, and we want to talk a little bit more on compliance and kind of specifically how can organizations really start to get traction on implementing automated ways to demonstrate compliance. And so, Kyle, can you talk to us, give us some, very specific examples?
Yeah, that sounds great, Keela. And in our last chats, we focused on how compliance can draw some similarities from software engineering. And we also talked about why compliance can be so frustrating. But for this talk, I think it would be great to let's get into the use case level. Let's talk in specifics about how you can bring an automated compliance system to life. And I think the best, starting point would be to talk about automated compliance in the scope of SOX. So Sarbanes-Oxley regulations. And this is, I think, a really attractive target. First of all, because a ton of companies are, have to adhere to this reg. And then secondly, what's good about SOX is that it narrows the known universe from every process, every application into just the processes and applications that are required for financial integrity. And so it gives us a chance to kind of cut the universe down a little bit, and then really kind of hone in on this key risk area that deals with financially significant applications. So we should break down automation in the context of SOX.
That sounds good. Okay, first, just give us a rundown of, what is SOX? What is a particular, use case that we could look at?
Sure. So fundamentally, with SOX, it's a regulation that was kind of born out of the Enron era in 2001, and it deals with controls and attestations that have to take place to make sure that there's, the appropriate level of integrity can be placed on the financial reporting of public companies. And so when I said it narrows the known universe, let's kind of focus the conversation on the financially significant applications that are responsible for financial statement reporting. And so the use cases, there's many, but a few that I think to try to make it as real as possible deal with making sure that there's evidence of change into production systems that are used to produce financial statements, making sure that there's appropriate segregation of duties and controls around who can access that data, who can make a change, and then the last thing being, the integrity of the transactions that flow through. At the end of the day, for publicly traded companies, we want to be able to pick up the 10K or the financial statement and believe that it's accurate, believe it hasn't been tampered with. And so compliance controls in the context of SOX really have to deal with those things. So production changes to the environment, appropriate controls around privilege of who can make a change, and then ultimately leading to high integrity of the financial statements. That's sort of what we're talking about when we're
Okay,
talking about SOX.
got it. Okay, so give us a scenario. Auditor shown up. Now
Yeah.
what?
Be scared. No. No. Take a sick day. Take a personal health day. No. I'm just kidding, of course. All right, but if you remember to our previous conversation, what can sometimes be difficult about compliance is that there is a time period. There is a window with which transactions can be inspected, and that window is usually annual. SOX compliance audits are going to take place on an annual basis. So if I'm an operator in this kind of environment, it's possible that I could get a transaction sampled anytime in the past year. And that's what we talked about. It's so tough. This isn't just
Mhm.
showing, hey, yesterday's nightly flow ran great. Here's the results. It's okay. So now I have to demonstrate evidence on a sampling basis of a transaction that might have taken place 6 months ago, let's say. So let's use that as an example. And so what I need to do now is, so how do I show evidence of what changes took place before the sampled transaction? How can I show evidence that there was appropriate approval for that change? And then how can I show evidence that least privileges in place? So only those with the need to do their jobs have access to that particular financial system. And in this case, there's appropriate controls that I can't go in and change a transaction for my own personal benefit or in the scope of SOX to make the company's financials look better than they actually are. So that's really what we're talking about, I think, is let's picture ourselves at 6 months ago. I now need to show evidence of the change authorization as well as the privilege of who can access that particular system and under what sort of conditions can they make a change to a transaction.
Okay, great. I like the scenario and it makes sense. Now, how can a company using automation be able to do this, be able to respond to the auditor?
Yeah. Um, well, and let's like face reality, right? This isn't usually one system. Like it never works that way. It's never homogenous where it's just one particular thing. So like let's talk about a couple of them. Like so you probably have some sort of change ticketing system, a way that you submit a ticket. You have some degree of segregation of duties that authorizes a production change to take place. There's lots of products that deal with ticketing, and
Hmm.
then let's assume that you have a couple of different financial systems. So I think before we get even to a lower level of detail, like let's just set the stage there and go, okay, so I've got a ticketing system that I use for change. Then I've got privilege on a couple of different systems that I need to be able to show that the transactions flowed through without being tampered with. Have I
Hmm.
lost you yet?
Nope, still
Okay.
here.
Okay. Cool. So then I think for a company just starting out on their automation journey, the best piece of advice that I can give is take the output from those systems as they exist today, centralize them, and then you've got a repository that you can use to show that evidence. Okay, so like let's make that a little bit more real, for example. So let's kind
Yeah,
of
how do
work
I do that?
left
Yeah.
to right. Yeah, so um, whatever ticketing system that you're going to use is going to have some form of a log, some way to evidence that you've actually submitted a ticket for a particular change, a scope of a change within a particular change window, and that you have some degree of a segregation of duty or a management authorization. More modern companies have built their ticketing system into their CI/CD pipelines and workflows, which is really cool, but it still satisfies the same fundamental thing, which is me as an engineer, I cannot just go in and make a production change. There has to be some evidence of um, authority to do that. And then there's a variety of different systems that you can put in place in terms of showing evidence of test that I tested my change, that it was peer reviewed. It doesn't exactly have to be that pure management authorization, but it's important that there is some degree of segregation of duty, authorization, and then there's an audit log or a trail that shows, okay, cool, so that change actually took place. And that's generally encompassed within one system, but that system does usually spit out logs, and systems like that make it very easy to do kind of query-based searching between X date and Y date these changes took place. Now, we'll go into the financial systems for a second. So let's assume that there's multiple here. The first and best way, I think, to capture evidence around the controls of privilege is to be able to show sort of both positive cases and negative cases. And so if there's a very easy way to export a log that shows, for example, the Active Directory groups that have maybe read access or they have write access, um, start there. Sort of start with what you have access to, what doesn't require any custom coding or any custom scripting. Nearly all systems are
Mhm.
going to have some way to evidence who has access to what at what time period. And then what I think is the best practice is, not to make it overly complex, like if you don't want to do any sort of procurement of an automated tool or anything like that, it simply starts with having a centralized repository of where you can store this evidence. And that's a fancy word, a centralized repository. It can be as simple as a shared drive in
Okay.
SharePoint, just a shared folder. And so then creating an automated script that can pull the evidence from your ticketing system in, it can pull the privileges from each of those financial systems in. And ideally, those financial systems are going to do some form of a nightly log. That's, I mean, pretty standard, even in legacy tech, to say, here's what we process under what sort of credentials today. And
Hmm.
so the the automation takes place by, first of all, knowing that this is your control set. These are the particular systems and scope of assets that are needed for me able to prove these SOX controls are operating effectively. And so grab the logs out of those three systems, move them into a folder, and then when your auditor comes by, if you do this every single night, let's say with an automated script, you can just simply go into the folder that's dated with the particular transaction that the auditor is looking at and be able to affirmatively show, okay, yes, we had a ticket for the change. Here are the privileges. Only those people that had, read access had read access into the system. And so basically what I'm doing is trying to simplify a pretty dynamic environment to simply go, here's my shared folder with my evidence of the controls that were running at the time that that transaction took place. And then that can run pretty much every single day of the year which makes it, when it comes time to show evidence for SOX compliance, you can go right into the transaction, you can pull in this evidence and show it. Now, we sort of talk about that like that's a pretty manual approach. There are job schedulers, and there is software that is usually being used to manage um, the nightly processing across a bunch of different financial systems. Our favorite software is Title software that does that. And that's,
Mhm.
rather than having to code up that script manually, it's already a perfect tool that can be used that's already scheduling jobs and creating these workflows. When one job ends in one system, the next one kicks off. That exact same concept can be used here, which is I'm going to go out, I'm going to retrieve my evidence from these systems. I'm going to package it nicely in a way that I understand what process and when it ran, and I'm going to put it into a shared repository. And then remember, have good controls on that shared repository. Not everybody should be able to access that. Like you have to continue to implement least privilege. But that's, I hope, like a way of trying to distill down a really complex topic to go, these disparate systems already are producing logs and producing evidence. So this is about just creating automated systems, either manually or from a centralized scheduler, that can collect that evidence and organize it in such a way that when you need to come back 6 months, in the future to today and say, okay, did this transaction process, do I have confidence that it wasn't tampered with, that it has a high integrity? You've got a really nice blueprint of automated control of automated evidence that can be shared with that auditor and say, hey, look at this, Keela. Yes, there was an approved change the night before. Only those people that had the appropriate need to access the system had it. And then ideally, you go, we only had read access, so there was no way to tamper with the transaction. So ultimately, auditor, as you're doing your sampling, you can have a high degree of confidence that this transaction processed as it was supposed to, unimpinged by any tampering or tinkering. And when you do that in batch across all of your systems, it makes your SOX audit flow quite a bit faster with a lot less expense and a lot higher degree of assurance that the integrity of that financial transaction flowed through wire to wire without any sort of any sort of tampering or any risk to it.
Awesome. Okay, so that example was wonderful. Thank you for breaking that down. It is understandable on, use what you have, bring it together. Some easy, automation tools that are likely already in your environment that you can use to be able to make this happen. And I think, this example kind of goes back to where you started, which was start small, right? There's
Yeah,
there's a lot
exactly.
of regulations, that you have to follow. There's a lot of controls out there. Don't try and do them all at once. Start with a few and create that automated process, make your life easier right there, and then go to the next, and then go to the
Yeah.
next. And then over time, you can end up with a highly automated compliance, organization. And I guess could you tell me just a little bit more as we wrap this up here? Just what are some of the other things? Like, let's say, yes, I've started small, and I've continued to add on, piece by piece over time, and that's going great. Now what? Like, what else can I do
Yeah.
on my, compliance automation journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think you talked about like the number one red herring, which like I cannot stomp my foot loud enough and say, don't just buy a piece of SOX compliance software and stick it in and expect that you can then re-engineer all of your processes to populate that. I think that's one of the most common ways companies go wrong is they attempt to do this full automation of everything. Instead, advocating more the way that you summarize that, which is start small. One of my favorite quotes is like, start where you are with what you have. Like, these are existing controls, they're existing log files for applications you're already using. That is where you can use your existing tool set. There's really no cost to what I described, right? You either have a centralized job scheduling application like Title and you can use it, or you're already using it, or, I mean, you can just script this with Batch or with Python. There's lots of different open source ways that companies can start to gain success. And then I think once you've done a handful of these, you're in a much better position to like understand, okay, so my current system is good in these ways. Now it's time to make a bigger investment in a more structured tool. Or maybe you actually never even make that investment because the control environment is going to be dynamic. You're going to be making changes over time. And so I just think the way you said that is so good. It's like start with what's in your control, start small, get a couple of laps around the track of interacting with auditors and proving that your system is working and expand and grow from there. And then if you hit a certain inflection point and say, okay, cool, now let's invest in a compliance management system, great. But I think that's the best way to get success is go risk by risk and make sure that you've got the control as automated as possible and work your way down that risk assessment. And it's those small investments, like the 1% investment that you make every day has a huge, huge payback at the end of the year versus that big bang. Okay, let's re-engineer everything. Let's get everyone in the system. I think those are really expensive. Those are really long running projects. So start with what you have, where you are, make those little investments over time, and that will add up to a massive, massive result.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you, Kyle. This has been very useful, very helpful. Thank you for sharing your recommendations on this. And for
You bet.
anyone that would like to talk a little bit more about this use case or maybe even explore some other use cases, you can find us at deciseglobal.com. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.